take a look at this house. What do you see? Now, maybe it's all the late nights in architecture studios, and believe me, it could be, but this building is talking to me. To be honest, all buildings talk to me. You see, architecture, it isn't just a roof over one's head or a fancy cathedral, it's a language. Like a poem, the architectural elements are references and metaphors which speak to their larger social, political, and economic contexts. History, climate, identity, all of these are collapsed onto that singular object. Now, architects were trained to read these layers, and so the whole city is speaking to us, yelling at us. But we kind of do a bad job of sharing that and telling everyone else what buildings are saying. And so today, I'd like to take you with me to Manila, Philippines, and we're going to break down what a house like this might have to tell us. Let's start with a quick history on the relationship between the United States and the Philippines and why I became interested in these houses in the first place. In fact, let me tell you something I didn't know until about a year ago. The Philippines was a colony of the United States of America from 1898 to 1946. And the US wasn't just any colonial power. The way they ruled was later called neo-colonialism. Now, under neo-colonialism, instead of the traditional master-slave relationship, colonizers seek a more subversive means of control. The idea is to make the colonized unaware of their own exploitation. So the US was there to help the Filipinos. And by establishing English-speaking schools and flooding the market with American consumer goods, they helped Filipinos think and consume the way that Americans do. It was the Filipinos' dreams that they sought to colonize. Now, when I learned about this history, I became extremely curious. I wondered, what would this American neo-colonial dream look like? What would the architecture have to say about that complicated question of post-colonial identity? And how do the Filipinos see all of this? It was with these questions and a lot to learn that I received a research grant to travel to Manila, Philippines, and find out for myself. Now, when I arrived in Manila, I began my search. There were these houses that quickly stuck out. They spoke to me loudly. They were bright and colorful and decorated, and something about them reminded me of the houses back in Minnesota. I began to call them Filipino dream houses. It's because they have this aspirational quality, a look which says grandeur, exorbitant, success, this American dream quality. See, American houses, they have this thinness to them. They're made from wood studs and aluminum siding, but they have a layer of brick or stucco applied to the surface. We call that the facade. This allows the image of the house, the look of it, to be free from its material reality and express something grander, the dream. In the Philippines, houses are made from concrete blocks, but likewise, their facade shows something totally different. Under neocolonialism, America became the image of aspiration for many Filipinos, and thus the images of American houses served as inspiration for Filipino houses. The Filipino dream house uses the same technique as the American ones, pulling together many images to create a facade with the right look. They appear as collages of architectural elements like balconies and pitched roofs, pulled from a catalog of American dream parts. But they don't exactly look like American houses do. The elements, they feel off. In the Filipino dream house, things are bigger, different colors, or kind of out of place. One may understand this as a misinterpretation, but I suggest there's something smarter going on. Let's think about it this way. If we take dream as the base condition, the imported aspiration, then that American dream confronts many local realities. I'm going to talk about 3 of them today: climate, site, and code. Each has its own parameters and history. In the Filipino dream house, there's a collision between the dream condition and the local condition. And that collision is resolved by the modification of a particular architectural element. And it's that element which feels off. It's that element that's speaking to us, that's expressing the conditions that built it. It's that element in its modification that's taking ownership over the foreign style and producing something unique. Let's start with the modification prompted by climate. In this equation, we have the imported condition of dream colliding with the local condition of climate. The result is the modification of the architectural element, roof. The Philippines, unlike the US, is tropical. This means intense heat and heavy rains. Luckily, architecture can mediate this climate through its shape. So, what can architecture do in a tropical climate? For this, we look to the traditional Filipino dwelling, the bahay kubo, which has been optimized for its climate. That roof of the bahay kubo is the architectural element which is serving as its primary climatic mediator. Its steepness easily sheds the tropical rains. Its height allows the hot air to rise, and the openings allow it to escape. The large overhangs protect the windows from rain and shade the walls from sunlight. So, in the Filipino dream house, we see the roof take on these same attributes, resulting in its dramatization. So let's look at some of the examples which I documented in my research. In this house, that large overhang is accompanied with an exaggerated trim, which is actually a gutter, scaled up to capture the heavy rains. Underneath, we see that the roof is open, allowing the sun-baked air to escape for cooling. In this house, every window is protected with its own pitched overhang. And in this house, there's a doubling of the roof, one on top of the other, making it more dramatic. This dramatization of the American-style roof with swollen gutters, exaggerated pitches, bigger overhangs, multiplied roofs is placed within the context of a tropical climate and actually shows a logical and necessary appropriation. It's here that we see an act of design, adapting that American dream aesthetic to the Filipino conditions. In this element, which feels kind of off, the roof, we see that story begin to emerge. Next, let's look at the modification prompted by site. In this equation, we have the imported condition of dream colliding with the local condition of site. That's the plot of land that the house is built on. The result is the modification of the architectural element, scale. So why don't we start with the question, how did these lots get so narrow? We return to the beginning of the American colonial period, the early 20th century. Manila was facing a series of epidemics. The neighborhood where the dream houses were was, at the time, densely packed with bahay kubos. Colonial officials targeted these living conditions as the cause of disease, and so they removed the existing homes and in their place laid out new neighborhoods called sanitary barrios. These sanitary barrios were planned to combat overcrowding, threat of fire, but also to combat the Filipino way of life. Blocks were laid out with regular plots, 36 feet by 45 feet, neatly spacing out the bahay kubos. This street pattern of long, narrow blocks is actually still visible in the urban fabric of Manila today. Over the years, as land was sold and divided amongst family members, the plots got narrower and narrower. Today, the modern cinder block houses are squeezed into the 36-foot, but also 18-foot and even 12-foot lots. But the American dream house is much larger than that. In order to fit all the bigness of the dream into an 18-foot lot, the architectural element of scale or size is manipulated. Let's look at some examples. Now, this house is only 12 feet wide. It subdivides the volume of its upper story. Even though one of those spaces is only 4 feet, we do get the look of a larger house because of the multiple volumes. In this house, as many volumes and elements as possible are crammed into that 18-foot facade. Compared to the American house, they may look crowded, but it's actually the presence of these elements which is important. And in this house, all the elements are miniaturized, providing plenty of room for the grandeur of the dream. Sure, the tower is only 4 square feet, but it's kind of amazing. All the elements of this American dream style, balconies, turrets, columns, are fit into the Filipino dream house facade, no matter how narrow the plot. These elements, they carry strong symbolism, which serves its own purpose in presenting the house as a symbol of success. The designers of these houses freely use those symbols, adjusting their size where necessary to create the desired look. And the emphasis on the presence of these elements over their practicality reveals the image-based intent of the facade decorations. Finally, let's take a look at the modification prompted by building code. So in this equation, we have the imported condition of dream colliding with the local condition of code. That's like the rule book for building houses. The result is the introduction of a new element, the firewall. Since the lots of the former sanitary patios are so narrow, people tend to build to the very edges of their property. When houses are built so close together, fire safety becomes a major concern. If one house were to catch on fire, that could quickly spread throughout the whole block. In order to protect these homes from neighborhood-wide blazes, the building code requires that a firewall be built. A firewall is a thick concrete wall that separates two buildings that would otherwise be touching. The code requires these walls to have a 2-hour fire rating, which means they could hold back fire from the other side for 2 hours. Here's the thing, that American dream house is freestanding, and so the firewall is not included in the imported architectural vocabulary. The Filipino dream house adds the firewall to the vocabulary and invents its own ways to incorporate it stylistically. Let's look at some examples. Now in this house, the firewall is projecting far beyond the facade, creating a shadow box effect. It's framing the scene of the house between its walls. In this house, the firewall is assimilated into the style like an oversized column. It's as if it's this intentional part of the look rather than a safety requirement. And in this house, the firewall turns the side of the building into this amazing cross-section. Even the cornices and decorations are incorporated into that slice. The firewall doesn't exist in the American houses in magazines and TV shows, and for this reason it feels kind of off. But the firewall tells us two things. First, its introduction into the architectural vocabulary of the Filipino dream house is the result of building code, and so it tells us about necessary safety requirements. On the other hand, the architectural expression of the firewall tells us that it's more than just a requirement. It's new territory for design and invention. Okay, we made it. We've delaminated some of the layers of the Filipino dream house, and we've come out the other side with some buildings that have a lot to say. The exaggerated roof tells us about climate adaptations. The miniaturizing and subdividing and stuffing of the facade begs us to question how those lots got so narrow. The introduction of a new element, the firewall, tells us about safety precautions in a dense neighborhood. The look, that American dream style, tells us about how that dream was brought to the Philippines. And the elements, in their manipulation and modification, tell us about a post-colonial identity which is reclaiming agency and making the style their own. It's by appropriating and adapting that American dream that these houses become something irrefutably Filipino. And it's not just these houses in Manila that have so much to say. Every building has layers. Every building is a manifestation of the conditions which created it. And so I hope I've inspired you to take a better look at the world around you, to look at architecture with curiosity, what's behind its funny shapes. And who knows, maybe the buildings will start yelling at you too. Thank you.